So welcome everybody to this special Men's Elder Wisdom Circle. This is something we do every month at the Fifth Direction with Tim Young and Walton Stanley. We've been doing it now for well over 2 years. And given it kind of coincided with International Men's Day, we figured why not open it up to a wider audience. And Tim and Walton were, of course, more than happy to accommodate that. So firstly, just thank you to both of you men for allowing that and being so gracious with your time as always. Before I hand over to the men, I'm just going to invite everybody just to take a moment and get settled. And when you feel ready, just allowing the eyes to close down if you can, if it's safe. I'm just noticing where you are right now. For some of us in Australia, it's Sunday morning early. For others, coming to the end of your Saturday. We're just allowing all those different parts of yourself to catch up. All those roles and responsibilities we have, we tend to become a little fragmented at times. This is an opportunity just to call all those different parts home as best you can. It's never a perfect practice. Noticing your body breathing, the inhale and the exhale. And take a moment to welcome in the guides and the allies from all four directions: north, south, east, and west. For us here at the Fifth Direction, we turn inward, recognize the sacred direction inside us, the vertical direction. We notice our connection to the floor or the chair. Acknowledging the Great Mother beneath our feet. And send your energy down through the floor, through the foundations, into the dirt. And at this moment, it's an opportunity to recognize the original owners of the land upon which each of us is sitting. For me here in the east coast of Australia, it's the Arakwal people, the Bundjalung Nation. I recognize their everlasting connection to this land, this country. I acknowledge elders, past, present, emerging. And so holding that groundedness, we pull that energy up through the body, maybe on an inhale. Maybe suspending the breath in the center of the chest. And on an out breath, sending it upwards, out through the crown of the head, feeling that infinite expanse, infinite universe above, cosmos, star nations. Holding that energy from the earth to the sky. And finally, we bring our attention back to the center of our chest. Acknowledge all the brothers here circle with us today. Acknowledging yourself for taking the time to show up, full presence. Extending those well wishes out to all brothers, sisters. All forms of life. So when you feel ready on this International Men's Day, feel free to crack open the eyes again. Maybe looking at your brothers on the grid here. And with that, I'll hand proceedings over to Tim and Walton. Thank you, men.
Good to see you fellas. Even though it's been a month for some of you, it's in other ways it seems like a lot longer. I wanted to begin with a poem, and then Walton will tell a story. This poem is from my upcoming book, which I had the publishers meeting this week, and so it'll be ready in January. But this poem fits the theme of the story Walton will tell in one way or another. And this poem, the prompt I used for this poem was N.C. Wyeth's illustration for the book Treasure Island. And this particular illustration is titled Goodbye Mother, when Jim Hawkins is heading out on his adventure. So the title of the poem is Mother Remains Like a Tree. Jim Hawkins is shipping out, and his mother weeps into her apron. The blue sky behind the ochre house with its greenish hues intensifies Wyeth's manipulation. Treasure Island is a boy's tale. 49 years ago, I quit work and school to hitchhike the country. Unlike young Jim, I didn't have a patron or a seafaring job. I went alone into the unknown. Years later, my mother said she cried as I left, but wouldn't let me see her that way. My father had reminded her, it's natural for a boy to leave home and seek adventures. I slept in tree groves and small fallowed fields just beyond the highway. I found my great uncle who took me to my grandfather's boyhood home. I found mountains and deserts for the first time and tasted the Great Salt Lake. When a boy like Jim Hawkins leaves for the outer world, tears may cleanse everyone's eyes. His mother remains like a tree with spread limbs, bark, and heartwood. His inner world is rooted. My mother said, when your brothers left, I didn't cry. It's just that you went first. I had to learn to let it happen. Sunday is Mother's Day. I'll praise her, dead now for 5 years. I was the oldest of 11, the oldest of 7 brothers, and the first one to leave home. After that, my mother was grateful that we were leaving home.
Thank you, Tim. That poem does fit, I think, beautifully with the story. I was actually surprised to learn that there was an International Men's Day. I didn't realize there even was such a thing, and it seems like a lot of other kind of commemorative days are are commemorating people who have, suffered or been oppressed in some way, and now we're kind of establishing a day to recognize that, which is appropriate, I think. But it's a little strange to have a Men's Day because you don't think of men being oppressed, and I know obviously some men are, of course. But the thing I'm trying to say is that one of the things I think that is part of male beauty is our expendability. Biologically, the species doesn't need a whole bunch of, can lose a bunch of young men and still go on just fine. And this is true for other species as well. You just don't need that many males. And of course, men tend to take more risks, and men die earlier and die more frequently in accidents as young men and things like that. So, but part of that, I think, is part of our part of our aesthetic, and part of the beauty of being a man is in living in that expendability and accepting that and taking that role as the ones that take the hit for the community. So this story, I think relates to that theme. Long ago, perhaps not so long after the very creation of the world, in that time, the people of the North were living up in the land of the North, where the summer days were very long and the winter nights perhaps even longer. In those days, the way the people lived was this. They all lived together in a single round stone lodge. And what they would do is they would go out into the world in the spring and the summer and the warmer months, and they would collect and harvest and gather as much food and as many supplies as they could, and they would preserve all those things, and they would take them back to the stone lodge. And then, when the winter came and the big snows set in, they would go into the lodge and they would close it up and they would light the fires, and they would live on all they had gathered in the warm months. That's how it was. It went that way for some years, for some generations, and it worked well. But one year, spring came late, and the summer was cold and wet, and fall and winter came early. And when the people went into the great stone lodge and closed the door, and they looked at what they had collected to get them through the winter, they knew that it wasn't enough. They knew that it wouldn't get them through. And so the people met in council with the elders, and they discussed the matter, and what they decided to do was this. They decided that all the adults would starve. All the adults would stop eating altogether and would sleep as much as possible. And in that way, they could save enough food that perhaps, just perhaps, some of the children might make it through the winter. And that was the plan. And so they started their fast, and all the adults started sleeping as much as possible to take their minds off the gnawing pain in their gut, and also to conserve what little energy they had. So the adults would sleep through the night, and they'd get up for a few moments during the morning and distribute some rations to the kids, and then they'd go back to sleep and sleep all day if they could. Now, this meant that the children were left largely unsupervised. And they did what children do when they're unsupervised in the big lodge. They played, they made up games, they ran around, they did kid things. Among the children, there was a boy. He was the oldest boy, and he was kind of a ringleader. And one day, the oldest boy collected all the children, and he said, "Hey, I've got a new game. I got a new game for you." And the kids said, "What is it?" And he said, "It's called Calling in the Spirits." Well, how does it work? How does it play? How do we play it? The kid said. And he said, well, it's like this. He said, you guys all sit down facing me, and then I'll sing a song, and then we'll see what happens. And the kid said, sounds dumb. The oldest boy said, no, it'll be good. It'll be good. And being that he was the oldest boy and had powers of persuasion, he got the kids to go along with it. So he sat them all down, and he sat down facing them with his back to the window of the lodge. And then he took off his coat and he put it over the window. He covered the window so it was dark and spooky in the lodge. And then he closed his eyes and he began to sing. Hey, spirits, come to me. Hey, spirits, come to me. I call upon the spirit of the soul of the sea. Hey, spirits, come to me. Hey, spirits, come to me. I call upon the spirit of the soul of the sea. And when he had sung that a third time, the stones of the floor of the lodge began to levitate. They began to float around the room and fly around, and the kids all screamed and hollered, and they jumped up and tried to grab the stones, and they tried to ride on them, and they tried to duck under them as they were flying around, and the stones started zipping around this way and that, and all the kids were hollering and chasing the stones and carrying on. And when the things reached kind of a fever pitch, the oldest boy reached up and pulled his coat away from the window, and all the stones settled back to the place where they had been. And when the kids settled down again, the oldest boy said, now, let's make sure, promise me that this will be our little secret, this game. You won't tell any of the adults. Promise me you won't tell any of the adults. And the kids said, oh, yeah, well, we promise, we promise. And later that afternoon, the adults got up and they prepared a little food for some of the kids, and the kids kept their promise for about 45 seconds. And then they told their parents everything that had happened. They explained about the calling in the spirits and the stones flying around and all that exciting stuff. And word of this got back to the elders, who, to their credit, took it seriously. And so they called the oldest boy to them the next day, and they said, we want you to show us this calling in the spirits game. And so the oldest boy sat the elders down where he had sat the children, and he sat again with his back to the window. Once again, he took off his coat and he covered the window. Once again, he closed his eyes and he sang the song, hey, spirits, come to me. Hey, spirits, come to me. I call upon the spirit of the soul of the sea. And when he had sung it 3 times, this time, the stones didn't move at all. In fact, nothing at all happened in the lodge. But from outside the lodge, there could be heard a roaring and a bellowing. It was the roaring of a polar bear and the bellowing of a walrus. And the sound of those great beasts, that roaring and that bellowing, drew nearer and nearer and nearer to the lodge. And when they were right outside the lodge, what the elders did was this. They picked up that boy, still in a trance. They picked up the oldest boy and they flung him out of the lodge to the beasts. And he didn't even have time to hit the snow outside. He was plucked out of the air by the polar bear, who swung his great head and flung him once again high up into the air. But again, he didn't hit the ground, for he was caught, plucked out of the air under the tusks of the great walrus, who in turn swung his head and flung the boy again. And so the polar bear and the walrus, flinging the oldest boy back and forth between them, started to make their way across the fields of snow, flinging him back and forth like a rag doll. Polar bear to walrus, walrus to polar bear. They went across the land, and when the land ended, they came to where the sea ice was, and they didn't stop there. They walked right out onto the sea ice, still flinging the boy back and forth, walrus to polar bear to walrus. And when they came to the edge of that sea ice, they met the great green cold sea. But they didn't stop there either. They dove right in and began to swim to the bottom, and they continued to fling the boy back and forth between them under the water, just as they had done through the air, flinging him back and forth, polar bear to walrus, walrus to polar bear. They took him down to the very bottom of the sea. And there they found a river under the sea, and they followed that river into a land under the sea. They continued flinging the unconscious boy back and forth as they made their way along the banks of that river, going upstream. And they went upstream all the way up that river until it came to a large bend in that river. And sitting at that bend was a little cottage, a little lodge. And it was there on the gravel near that lodge at the bend of that river. They flung the boy down on the gravel and went on their way. Now, after a time, the oldest boy came to. He regained consciousness. And though he was somewhat roughed up from his journey, he was basically all in one piece. And he stood up and looked around, and he saw that little lodge, that little cottage. And not knowing what else to do, he went into it. There was a room in front, but no one was there. But there was another room behind that room. And when he went into that room, he saw sitting on a stool in that room the oldest woman he could even imagine. Her face looked like the mountains itself. Her hair was an enormous white tangle that haloed her head. It looked like a rising moon over the mountain. And he noticed something else about the woman. She had no hands. Both of her hands had been cut off at about the forearm, beneath her elbow. Now behind that woman there was a table, and on that table there were three things. There was an ivory comb, and there was a polished obsidian bowl, a shallow bowl with a little water in it. And there was a ribbon of sealskin sitting on that table. And the old woman looked right at that boy, right through that boy, right into his eyes, right into his soul. And the old woman said, "What can you do for me?" And the oldest boy considered that question for a time, as should we. And then the oldest boy walked over to the table, and he picked up that ivory comb, and very gently he began to comb the old woman's hair. He began to untangle all of the strands. He began to work that comb carefully through her hair, supporting the hair so he didn't pull on her scalp. He very gently, very slowly, and very carefully began to untangle her hair. It took a long time. He combed and combed and combed. And as he combed, he noticed that little sea creatures, small fish, and little crabs and eels came out of her hair and began wriggling about on the floor and wriggling out of the cottage and back into the river. And he continued combing and straightening that tangled mass of hair on the old woman's head while she sat there motionless and let him do it. He combed for a long time, who knows how long. Eventually, he combed all the sea life out of her hair, and he straightened all her hair so that it hung down her back far and shone. And then he set the comb down for a moment, and he picked up the ribbon. And he picked up the comb again, and he separated her hair, and he began to braid it in the way that the women of his village did, in the way that he'd seen his mother do for his sisters or his aunts do for his granny. He began to braid the old woman's hair. And when he had braided it, he tied it up in that sealskin ribbon. And then at last, he set the comb back down and stepped back. And the old woman turned to the table, and she looked down into that obsidian bowl of water and saw her reflection. And just the faintest smile played across her eyes. And then she nodded over to a little hatch that was on the wall, and the hatch opened. And sea life of every kind, fish and sharks and whales and seals and otters and crabs and sea life of every description began to pour out of that hatch, began to move out of the cottage and into the river and out into the sea, out into the wide world. On and on it went. The sea life continued to just pour out of that place. And after a long time, finally, she nodded again, and the hatch closed. And then the old woman spoke to the oldest boy, and she told him, taught him the way that the people should harvest the sea life. She told him that the people should take only what they need and should use all they take. And she taught him that when a hunter takes a seal, the hunter should give the seal a drink of fresh water, not salt, fresh water, so that the spirit of that seal would remember that kindness and remember that sweetness, that sweet taste of fresh water, and would jump up and live again and come back to be hunted in another generation. She taught the boy that the bones of the seals were to be revered, and the people weren't to allow the dogs to run around with them. They were to keep the bones safe, and later to take them to a hill overlooking the sea and bury them there with reverence. She taught him all this and other things. And then the old woman indicated that it was time for the oldest boy to go. And so the oldest boy stepped out of the lodge back on to the riverbank. And he stood there for a moment, I suppose, wondering how he was going to get up from the bottom of the sea, back across the ice and across the land. But he didn't have to wonder for long, because coming to meet him were his old friends, the walrus and the polar bear. And they snatched him and began to fling him again, and he passed out. They flung him walrus to polar bear to walrus, back and forth. Limp like a rag doll he was. They made their way down that river and out to the sea. And finally they came out at the bottom of the sea, and they swam up, throwing him again through the water as they had done through the air, flinging the boy back and forth, walrus to polar bear to walrus. And when they got to the surface of the sea, they swam along the surface, still flinging the unconscious boy back and forth between them. When they got to the sea ice, they climbed out onto the sea ice and continued to fling him and made their way inland toward the land. And when they got to the land, they continued across the wide fields of snow, flinging the boy the whole way until they got near the lodge, roaring and bellowing. As they went, they flung the boy back and forth between them. And when they came near the lodge, they threw the boy roughly down into the snow and then turned and made their way back toward the sea. And inside the lodge, the people could hear the roaring and the bellowing. And when that sound subsided, they opened the door and they saw crumpled in the snow the oldest boy. And the elders went out and they examined him. There was almost no life left in him now. He was very near death. And the elders picked up the oldest boy, and they carried him into the lodge, and they set him down on the furs near the fire, and they covered him, and they tended him. And after a time, they made a little thin stew with some of the food they had left, and they took just a little of it, and they put it on his lips. And eventually, the oldest boy tasted that food, and he opened his eyes, and he revived. And then he sat up on the furs, and he was instantly filled with tremendous strength and energy. And he went outside of the lodge, and he stood there in the snow, and he held out his arms as though he were a great tree in that great frozen wasteland. He stood there motionless with his arms extended, and birds began to land on him and take roost on his arms. And when his arms were full of birds, he caught the birds and broke their necks. And he brought these to the people to break their fast. And then he went out and he fashioned for himself a great harpoon. It was so heavy 10 men would have difficulty lifting it, but he hoisted it, hefted it as easily as you or I would hold an arrow. And he took that great harpoon down onto the sea ice, out to the edge of the sea, and there he saw a whole shoal of seals, and he cast that harpoon and he skewered the entire shoal of seals and brought them back. And he remembered to give the seals a drink of fresh water as the old woman had taught him. And he brought the seals back and he fed the people and he taught them the things that she had taught them, to not let the dogs run around with the seal bones, to treat the seal bones with reverence. He taught them to use what they take and to take only what they need. And whether or not the human beings, the people, remember those lessons, I don't know. But if they forget, why, some other oldest boy or perhaps an oldest girl will have to make that trip again to visit the old woman under the sea. Now, you know, this story was recounted in the lodge for some time. And one year there was a mouse who lived underneath the lodge. She heard this story and liked it very much, and so she took it down into her burrow, and it was carried and spread by the mouse people all over the Arctic. And that's why the story has so many fascinating little details, because mice are very detail-oriented beings. But one year, an Arctic ferret caught a mouse, and the story went into the ferret. And so it was carried by the ferret people for a time, for maybe 700, 800 years, I don't know. It was carried by the ferret people, and that's what gives the story its Weasley ways and its many twists and turns. But one year a ferret was on the sea ice looking in, trying to see if he could see a fish, and he fell into the sea, and that cold water took that ferret's life, and the ferret's body floated down to the bottom of the sea. And the story might have remained there, except nothing goes to waste in the sea. Crabs ate that ferret, and the story went into the crab people, and it was protected by their shells. And that's what gives the story its depth. And it was carried by the crab people for who knows how many centuries, or even millennia. But one year, a crab fisherman pulled up a pot of crabs, and one of those crabs was carrying the story. This was near Seattle. He took the crabs in and sold them at the fish market there, and they were bought by a restaurant, and they were turned into some crab chowder. And my friend Daniel Deardorff had that chowder, and the story went into him, and he told me, and now I've told you. Well, I can see Chris playing the fiddle, but I can't hear him. So as usual, I think we'll take some time and feed the story. I don't know if I don't really have a question other than maybe talk about a moment or an image that gripped you or grabbed you in some way, or.
Thank you, Walton. Sorry, I'll kick off. The image that's really stuck with me, and it was just reverberating the whole time you were talking, it was just this unconsciousness of the boy being flung between the polar bear and the seal. And it was almost this, you know, when you feel lost as a young man and you don't know where you're getting flung around everywhere, people telling you this and that, and you're running here and there. And I just had this just deep feeling of I've been in that spot and I've had that feeling. So that really stuck with me. It was beautifully told. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
It wasn't so much an image, but the sense of abundance versus scarcity. that tension that we carry. And when we're younger, we have that sense of scarcity. You know, we're driven. I think it's part of our soul's genetics. We're driven to experience the earth's sense of abundance, the earth's abundance, the abundance of the soul, the abundance of beauty. But we don't know how to do that. And that's one of the duties that those of us who are older have to help the younger ones with. Help them understand that there is abundance, there is beauty, there is a path, so that we can find that sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's especially important now. So much of the message that are going to young people is that we're in the end times. We're killing the earth. Blah blah blah. And yes, it's true. We're doing great damage, but I don't know that living in fear and in avarice is really going to be the solution. Living in scarcity.
Gentlemen, I've just as that story was, just as that myth was wrapping up, I pulled up to the Hawkesbury River rest area. So great timing. The part that really stood out for me was when the old woman looked into his soul and said, "What can you do for me?" And he pondered that question, and so should we. And that really spoke to the difference that I feel between the adolescent male or the immature masculinity versus the mature masculinity, which is, we're here to serve the divine feminine. And we can quite easily confuse that with, I will serve the divine feminine if there's something in it for me. And this woman, she was old, she had no hands, like there's nothing on the surface that she could actually do for this guy. But it was, what can you do for me? And he actually sat with that and offered what he could.
Yeah. Yeah. Whoops. Sorry, I lost you on the screen for a moment. But yes, I agree. And his response is to look toward her, toward her needs. So he doesn't fall into the trap of like, well, I'm a good juggler, or I have a talent. He looks outward.
Yep.
At that moment. Yep.
Yeah, he doesn't offer her a song, or something that he's comfortable with. Yeah, and I'm with you also, Nick. I'm standing in front of this old woman with no hands. It's just an arresting experience. Yeah, I like some of I was in India last month, and we went to this like shopping center. It's an equivalent of a mall, kind of an outdoor mall thing. And it was Navratri, the holiday, like 9-day holiday to the goddess Durga and the different forms that Durga, the mother, takes. And so we bought some things because we were going to do some services for Durga. And so I bought a little Durga Murti riding on an elephant, riding on a lion, this symbol of Durga. And as we got in the car, I noticed there's, homeless people around, and I noticed this older woman that looked like she was probably a street person, or had lived like she was half a block away or something. And I just remember noticing, and I got in the car, not thinking about it. I'm on this side of the car, the same that I'm in now. Maybe that's why the story or my memories here, but, and I'm talking to the other people in the car, and then there was this loud banging on the window, and I looked and it was her face right here, you know, toothless and kind of half crazy, and eyes that I couldn't see. I don't know if she was blind, and she was banging her hand awkwardly and loudly and saying Radhe really loud. Radhe, the name Radha, Krishna's wife, you know, and counterpart. And it just was so startling for me. Here I was, like, we were trying to prepare to these offerings to this mother goddess, you know, Murti, or these celebrations of the mother, and here was this starving mother banging on the window. Like, to me, what can you do for me? It was this very intense, straightforward, no bullshit moment. And I didn't have any small bills. I was looking, you know, I learned later to keep small rupee notes in my front pocket so that I could access them. And it was still, anyway, thanks for letting me share that with you guys, because it's been one of those, I felt so, you know, here I am, a man, my late 30s, if a Westerner, I have all these resources, and I'm healthy and physical, like I have all of these abilities, and this old woman saying, give some, you know, share, get, like, and unabashedly asking. And so, yeah, that's where I am in the story. Thanks, Walton.
Thank you.
I'm really enjoying the themes that have come up. A lot of them was exactly where I was too. One other thing that really stood out for me was the fact that the eldest boy was at first ridiculed by the other children for his, I guess, gift. You know, that he was somehow different, and when he tried to express that gift, it was, you know, that's dumb. I think was the word that Walton used, and I feel like I've kind of been there in my own life. And the kind of other half of that is when the elders found out that there appeared to me that there was a bit of not quite sure what the emotion is, whether it was sort of anguish or anger or something around the fact that he'd demonstrated this and, you know, do it for us. And there was this sense of him being kind of an outcast, at least with his own peers, but also with the elders. And that's what it took. You know, that's what it took. So rather than discard that genius, I guess, you know, he put it to use, and obviously it took him into all the necessary troubles, which almost led to actually him losing his life. But again, that's the necessary part of the journey, you know. So I was kind of struck with that, perhaps some similarities in my own early life.
Yeah. To me, that the moment when they hear the polar bear and the walrus, and then the elders just fling him out of the house, is the first time I heard the story, I was shocked, startled, you know. And of course, it's the right thing, but there's no guarantee he's going to come back, you know, that he's going to survive that. He almost doesn't, you know.
But that is the risk of going into the unknown. Yeah. And it seems, at least in our history, genetically, it's the male that goes into the unknown more often than the feminine. The masculine expression is to go out and defend, find the food, risk your life so that the life of the others and the young ones can continue. I think that's so deep in our genetic memory. It's that we can't avoid that. I know how when my son was born, suddenly that sense of being a protector just increased dramatically.
Yeah.
Before that, yeah, okay, that's fine. You know, there's the general sense of, oh, I'll defend my people, I'll defend this. But when it became my genetic offspring, something changed dramatically. It's as if my molecules were rearranged. Those of us with children know what it's like. And even now with grandchildren, I may not physically be able to be the defender as I was when I was a younger man, but I still have to defend with what I have. With the networks that I've developed over my life, with the spiritual dimensions and the access that I have there. And the stories, the memories that I have, to share those with my children, my grandchildren, my nieces, my nephews, so that they have a rootedness and they can feel safe in those memories. And I feel fortunate that I had that with my grandparents, with the elders that I grew up with. And then when I went out in the world and found elders such as Robert Bly and other teachers, it gave me a rootedness in some place else, another dimension, a dimension of the soul and spirit. And that's the role that we have to play as we get older. I cannot go onto a battlefield, but I can give expression and hope and memories and visions of the future and the visions of possibility and abundance and peacefulness. That's what good storytellers do. That's what the poets do. That's what the good leaders do.
Yeah, Tim, thank you so much for that. Really hit me like a punch in the chest there, Tim. So I appreciate you saying those words. For me, that idea of the rearranging of the molecules, when you enter into fatherhood, that was huge for me. I remember, and I wonder if other men resonate with this too. But when my son was placed in my arms for the first time, I felt that energy so strongly about the desire to protect and a love in a way that I hadn't felt before, that I almost didn't know what to do with it. And perhaps this is to do with the lack of initiation in our modern culture. But it was like, I remember a thought going through my head. It was like, they're just going to let me take this child home in my car with my wife. Like, no one's going to actually stop me. Like, I shouldn't be allowed to do this. and from that point on, as you spoke to, life is just not the same. So thank you for sharing that, brother. And before I finish off here, I was strongly I remembered you told a story, and I'm not sure whether it was in the gardening club or one of our circles, that when you first kind of hit the road, you camped a night out beside a river and drank the water, and the water was actually toxic and it nearly killed you. And I just, through the story and through what you were sharing just then, I was drawn right back into remembering you speak those words. It was so powerful for me at the time, but it does play into it, doesn't it?
Yeah. I had forgotten that. Yes. Yeah.
It might bear repeating for the others that hadn't heard it, if there's a 30-second version.
Oh boy. Yeah. But I was hitchhiking and I was in the sun for at least 24 hours and I was going nowhere. And there was the Muncie River nearby. So I went and threw my sleeping bag down next to the river. And I was deathly thirsty. I didn't realize that the Muncie River was so toxic. And I don't remember the context that led me to tell that little story, but I promised that if I could go through the night after drinking that water, you know, that I would definitely give myself over to a better purpose. And I did. I'm still selfish. I'm still very selfish. But that's part of going on the road. That's part of going on the road, facing those things.
Thank you for sharing that again, Tim.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Matt. I come from Michigan. Good to see you all today. Thank you for the invitation. Great story, great poem. I'm an artist, so yeah, I definitely resonate with NC Wyeth. He's been, you know, one of those teachers who just happens to be dead. That doesn't mean he's not teaching me.
Right.
And also, I've been drawing polar bears. My new graphic novels is got a big polar bear with a kind of like a Brooklyn accent. He kind of talks like this. So that's who I saw. You know,
Sounds about right.
Yeah. There was a couple of moments in the story that resonated with me in that kind of ticklish way that, you know, I would say, well, I would like something more dramatic, but these moments were potent in their subtlety and their quietness to me. And one of them was that the elders chose right away to sacrifice themselves, which is noble and could have had an effect that was positive. The second one was that, and I connect these two, was that the youth came forward with the other children and said, let's try something new. And to me, this talks about perhaps a culture that's like ours, where we've lost that aspect of our culture that acknowledges so much of that wisdom, that the young man's first inclination, or maybe his natural talent, was to say, I'm going to call on spirit. I'm going to go to the ancestors first. So those are two effective ways. Self-sacrifice, absolutely. We'll stop eating and whatever food we have will go to the children. But also, you know, asking spirit, you know, please come here. I can't figure this out. We need you. We're trying, but it's not working. And then the last thing was the youth combing the great mother's hair, the sea mother's hair, the handless mother's hair. The gentleness of that just floored me, because like I heard, you know, he didn't say, I'm going to sing a song. He wasn't going to go, you know, move the furniture for her. It was this gentle, beautiful noticing her, not what he could do to show his talents, but to acknowledge what her needs were, perhaps, even though she could be this great mother of the sea, presenting herself in this handless form, which is kind of scary and odd, and but at the same time, that's who she is. She can't comb her hair. I'll do it. And that gentle motion. The last thing I'll say then is, I was on a trip in Ireland by myself, and I had done some business there. I think it was when I went to a conference there. It was a literature conference, and I was out west, and I wanted to find Brian Boru's castle, where he lived as a young man. The great king, Brian Boru, you know, and I was in my late 30s, and, you know, I'd seen some things. I'm just got a car, and I was going to go find this thing. And also up above the castle, I'll shorten this, it was the cave of his soothsayer, which was a woman who had some acolytes, some young women with her. And that was supposed to still be there, along with the remains of the castle. And when I got out there, I found the castle, and I could see the hill where the cave was. And I found my way around, driving around to where the path was, but all around the hill, the side of the hill, all of the trees had been torn down. just laid waste. I mean, and there were clumps of dirt the size of small cars. I couldn't get to this cave. Now, the other aspect of this that I didn't tell yet was when I was back in Galway getting ready to go, an elderly gypsy woman had come up to me and wanted money, and I ignored her. She didn't smell good, as I remember, and I just said, no, I'm not giving you any money. I've got someplace to go, which was to go and find the great feminine. Here she was right here. She didn't look good. She didn't smell good. Maybe she was handless. And when I came down off of that mountain, I was so frustrated. My clothes were covered in mud. I had nice shoes on and they weren't nice anymore. And I remember heading back to Galway and I kept saying, I hope she's there. I hope she's there. I just want to give her some money. I screwed up. I just want to go give that gypsy woman some money, and she wasn't there. So rather than, get out I'm a Catholic or recovering from and, beating myself, just saying that's a lesson. That's an opportunity to be awake, that she was there right in front of me. So thanks for listening to me. I pass.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt. Beautiful told.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is, I'll just let you guys know. And when we told the story at the conference, there's kind of a companion story. It's not directly a companion story, but there's a story of the woman under the sea and why she has no hands.
Yeah.
Amen. Walton, I can't help but notice the parallels between this story and the skeleton woman.
Yep.
And the skeleton woman is brought up to the surface, and then the beautiful work begins of untangling the fishing line from her bones.
Yeah.
And in this story, the boy goes down to meet the old woman, and she's very old. She's been there for a long time, and she, in a similar way, requires the boy to bring his compassionate his compassion to the task of untangling, in the same way that the young fisherman in the skeleton woman brought his compassion to that task of untangling. And similarly, is a story of the sea and a story of abundance and a story of giving of one's own flesh to ensure future generations are fed. Thank you. Wonderful.
Thanks, Bear. And yes, absolutely. I noticed the similarities there too. It's a beautiful weaving. And Matt, I just wanted to just thank you also, brother. Your words, you gave me plenty. You gave me plenty of threads to pull on there. Some things that I hadn't quite picked up on. So I just want to name that and say thank you. I also love the fact that both you and JD kind of had similar stories where you kind of overlooked what was there until later, and you were both so gracious in the way you just saw it as a lesson rather than berating yourself too much, and that's a beautiful thing. Now we've got about 10 minutes left here, gents. I just wanted to call your attention to that. So yeah, over to anyone who's got something burning in their chest that needs to come out and isn't feeling complete.
Just a quickie, and thanks all, Tim and Walton and others for sharing, but a quickie from me. And I've been thinking about elderhood for some time and what it means and how you encourage it both ways. But what stood out for me is that young man has or had a gift. And I think, often we want to impart our wisdom and give our learnings as an older man, but sometimes for me, what I'm trying to do is just recognize the gift that a young man and a young woman might have, and to bring that gift out. Because look at the old farts leading the world at the moment. I think someone said it before, we need the energy of younger generations, not always our talking and our wisdom and our learnings. It's got to come from them. So that's all I wanted to say. I have been thinking about it a lot. And thank you. It really stimulated me today.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
I agree with you, Tom. But if the story gives us a clue. At the very beginning, the elders, they go to sleep. Now, in their sleep, it's not, I'm going to assume that sleep is not just turning everything off. It's more like allowing the youth. It's like stepping back, allowing the youthful energy to build up, to build. And then when the roar of the animals is there, they recognize that. Oh, okay, here, young man, you have to suffer now. Sorry, but you're going to have to suffer so that your gift can be useful for all of us. Because there's not a one of us who hasn't suffered, in our work, whatever our purpose is. Whatever we have to accomplish, we have to suffer to accomplish that. So the elder, as you said, we recognize what their gift is. And Walton mentioned this also once before. In the story of the fire on the mountain, the old man really cannot help the young man in the freezing cold. He can't be there with the young man, but he can be in the distance with his own small fire, so that the young man knows there's somebody thinking about him. So you're absolutely right, Tom. Quite often
Go ahead.
Quite often we just have to stand near a younger person.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. This helps me even as I think about my children and what they need from me and what other younger people need from me. Just be there and believe in them.
Yeah.
And, the one thing that has been mentioned, and the thing about the walrus, the kid getting thrown back and forth, I immediately went, oh, Sorcerer's Apprentice. What this power that I don't, oh shit, I called on them and now I'm in deep shit and I do not know how to do this.
Yep.
And I realized that even now as a quite older person, I'm gun shy, and I have to really allow myself to be chewed on. Go forward. The path, the path will appear, but if I'm not in motion, nothing happens. And also your poem, Tim, broke me open very sweetly. I had a similar experience. I didn't find out till a few years later that my mother did cry.
Yeah. Yep.
Chris, your what you said just then reminded me. I think it was Malidoma who said, "Forwards is death, backwards is death, so forwards."
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to fall down, so we might as well fall down forward.
Yeah.
Can I say one? I just want to say one more thing. It's a personal anecdote too. I teach at a college now, and I hadn't taught there. I started teaching a couple of years ago, and 20 years ago, I taught at this college art. And back then, there were far more young men in the classes. Now it's like almost 75% of the people in the class are young women. And right now, too, gender what they wish to be called is very important gender-wise. And so somebody will present themselves as to me, a young woman, but they want to be called him. And to me, that is an elder action for me to simply say, I can be here, be present, and not argue with you about whether or not you are this gender or that gender, and even let it go. That's not my issue. To me, that this story talks to that, and it will be helpful to me, going forward. So, boots on the ground kind of stuff with these stories is always really important to me. It means to me that the ancestors are talking to me, and this will be helpful going forward, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Are we just about ready to sign off there, Asher?
Yeah, I think so. Unless, as I said, if anyone's not feeling complete at this point and there's something they want to add before we kind of move into the closing phase, there is a moment. We're all good, Tim.
I just wanted to use a Rumi. It's actually not a poem, but it's a story. It's words from Rumi, and this is about the masculine energy and about teachers. Suddenly, Sheikh Karakani appears, riding a lion. Firewood is stacked behind him. His whip is a live serpent. Every sheikh rides a fierce lion, whether you see it or not. Know this with your other eyes. There are thousands of lions under your teacher's thighs, and all of them are stacked with wood for the fire. The masculine energy is expressive and it's fiery. It's something that this story, when the young man is getting thrown between the walrus and the polar bear, there's fire being built. But the balance also is going into the water. And it's the balance that we play with. And it's the balance that we have to accept. That's the wonders of stories and poetry, and the wise ones and the fools. And I feel very fortunate to be with you guys, you fools and you wise men.
Well, thank you, Tim. That was a beautiful way to finish off, I think. Wonderful words. I guess it's just left for me to say thank you to Tim and to Walton for the poetry and for carrying the story. Walton, thank you so much. The kind of tagline for International Men's Day in Australia is celebrating mateship, and I think we've done that superbly today. And just looking around at the faces on the screen, it's wonderful to welcome new faces. Some are familiar to me from Chris's beautifully hosted gardening club. But it's lovely just to see you in our space, across the oceans, in a kind of hands across the oceans kind of way. And I'd love to kind of continue that in some way, shape, or form. I think it's just beautiful. So that's really us. I think what I'd love to do, if it's okay with everyone, is just close with a minute's silence. Just to kind of feel into all the words that we've heard and the energy that we've co-created. So I'd invite you to just close down the eyes. Thank you, man. It's been an absolute pleasure as always, and I hope to see you again soon. Much love.
Thank you, Asher. Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Walt.